You see a lot of things in the mountains. The way a storm can turn the sky from a bright, clear blue to a bruised, angry purple in the space of a single breath. The silent, patient way the snow waits to bury the world. The courage of a deer as it leads her fawn across a treacherous, ice-slicked pass. But you never, ever get used to the sight of a child, standing alone in the middle of a blizzard, looking at you like you're the last hope in a world that's already given up on her. That look is a punch to the gut, a twist of a knife you can't see. It's the kind of thing that makes a man question every hard, lonely year he spent convincing himself he didn't need anyone, because in that moment, looking into those eyes, you realize you've been wrong all along. The first time I saw her, I thought she was a ghost, a trick of the light and the swirling snow, a figment of a mind that had been alone too long. I was up on the high ridge, checking my trap lines, a thankless task in a storm that was turning from a nuisance into a full-blown monster. The wind was a living thing, howling and shoving at my back, trying to push me off the mountain. My beard was a solid block of ice, and my fingers, even inside my thick mittens, were starting to feel like they belonged to someone else. I was cursing the weather, the wolves that had been getting too bold, and my own stubbornness for not heading back to the cabin hours ago. And then I saw her. A small, bundled-up figure, barely visible against the whiteout standing on the trail ahead of me. She wasn't moving, just standing there, a tiny, dark speck in a world of white. My first rational thought was that it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a swaying pine. But the figure didn't shift or dissolve. It just stood there, a silent, impossible presence in the heart of the storm. My heart lurched. A child. What in God's name was a child doing out here? My mind raced through a dozen terrible possibilities. A lost hiker, a survivor of an accident, a runaway. But there was no one else with her. No frantic parent, no other footprints in the snow, just her. I trudged forward, the snow crunching under my boots, my movements slow and deliberate. As I got closer, I could see she was wearing a coat that was too thin, the color of faded, sodden brown. A tattered scarf, the color of a faded sunset, was wrapped loosely around her neck. Her face was pale, almost blue, and her dark hair was plastered to her head with melting snow. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were enormous, the color of dark, polished stone, and they were staring at me with a mixture of terror and a desperate, gut-wrenching hope. "Hey there, little one," I said, my voice raspy from the cold and disuse. I had to shout to be heard over the wind. "You lost." She didn't answer. She just stared, her small body trembling. I crouched down, bringing myself to her level. It felt important, somehow, not to tower over her. A wolf wouldn't crouch. A threat wouldn't lower itself. I was trying to tell her without words that I wasn't either. "My name's Silas," I said, pointing to my chest. "I live just down the mountain a ways. I'm a friend." A flicker of something crossed her face. Doubt, maybe, or a desperate search for the lie in my words. Her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides. I made a decision in that moment. There was no way I was leaving her out here. It was a death sentence. I couldn't even fathom what kind of circumstances would lead to a child being alone in this. But the how didn't matter. Only the what did. And the what was a tiny human being who would freeze to death in a matter of hours if I didn't do something. "Look," I said, my voice gentler now. "The storm is getting worse. My cabin is a few miles down this trail. It has a fire, food. I have some good, thick stew with some potatoes and carrots. It's warm. Do you like warm stew?" A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first sign of life I'd seen. "It's a deal then," I said, forcing a gruff smile. "You get to eat my stew, and I get someone to talk to who isn't a mule or a pine tree. How does that sound?" Another nod. I held out my hand, my palm up, waiting for her to take it. It was a gesture of trust, of invitation. I had to wait for what felt like an eternity, the wind screaming around us, before her small, ice-cold hand slipped into mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong. We started our slow, trudging walk down the mountain. It was a nightmare. The snow was deep, and the wind was so fierce it was hard to even see my own boots. I had to guide her, placing her feet where they wouldn't get tangled in the roots or rocks that lay hidden beneath the fresh powder. She was silent, too, her energy completely focused on just putting one foot in front of the other. I talked the whole way, a low, steady stream of nonsense just to fill the silence. "That's a good girl, almost there. See that big, funny-looking rock up ahead? That's my landmark. Means we're only a half-mile away. You know, one time I saw a bear scratch his back on that rock until it nearly fell over. You'd think the darn thing would have learned, but nope. Same bear, same rock every spring." She didn't say a word, but I felt her hand squeeze mine once, a silent acknowledgement that she was still there, still fighting. It was more communication than any amount of words could have been. It felt like a small eternity before we saw the dim, yellow light of my cabin window glowing through the snow. A sight that usually meant nothing but a place to sleep was suddenly the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I almost wept with relief. I half carried her the last few yards, my arm around her shaking shoulders. I kicked the snow from the door, fumbled with the lock, and practically fell inside with her. The warmth of the cabin hit us like a physical wall. The fire in the wood stove had burned low, but the embers still glowed, and the space was blissfully warm. I set her down gently by the fire and immediately got to work. I threw a few more logs on the fire, coaxing the flames back to life with a practiced hand. I pulled my heavy wool blankets from the bed and wrapped her in them until she looked like a small, trembling cocoon. She was still silent, her eyes darting around the small room, taking in the cast-iron stove, the worn armchair, the crooked shelves of canned goods and books, the rifle mounted above the door. I busied myself with the kettle, putting it on the stove to make some hot tea. I needed a moment to process what had just happened. Once the tea was ready, I poured 2 cups, adding a generous spoonful of honey to hers. I'd forgotten how small children's hands were. Her fingers, still stiff from the cold, wrapped around the chipped mug like it was a lifeline. I sat in my chair, a few feet away, wanting to give her space. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked, my voice quiet. "I can't just call you hey, you." She was silent for a long time. I figured she might not speak the language, or maybe the cold had stolen her voice. I was about to offer her some stew when a small, hesitant voice cut through the crackling of the fire. "Kai." "Kai," I repeated, the word feeling good in my mouth. "That's a strong name. Is it short for something?" She shook her head, the movement small and fragile within the cocoon of blankets. "Just Kai." "Well, Kai, it's a pleasure to meet you." I gave her a small, respectful nod. "I hope you like venison stew, my grandmother's recipe. She used to say the secret was to let it cook low and slow and to not forget a pinch of sage. I always forget the sage." The ghost of a tiny smile flickered across her lips. It was the first crack in her armor, and it was like a ray of sunshine breaking through the storm outside. I got her a bowl of stew, and she ate it with a ravenous, quiet intensity that spoke of a long time without a proper meal. As she ate, I finally had a chance to think. My mind was spinning. Kai, a child all alone in a blizzard. I had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what had brought her here. Was she a runaway from some town? Had there been an accident? I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. People didn't just appear out of nowhere in these mountains. And a little girl was a responsibility I wasn't prepared for, a burden I hadn't asked for. My life was built on solitude, on a careful routine that never deviated. It was a simple life, a hard life, but it was mine. And now this tiny, quiet girl was sitting in my cabin, eating my stew, and I had no idea what to do. Was I going to be a rescuer or a jailer? The thought left a sour taste in my mouth. I couldn't just let her go back out into the storm. But how long would she be here? A day? A week? What if no one came for her? What if there was no one to come for her? I looked at her, her small hands wrapped around the warm bowl, her dark eyes staring into the fire. There was a profound sadness in her gaze that seemed far too deep for a child, a grief that was ancient and heavy. After she finished, I took the bowl. Her eyes were getting heavy, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The warmth was doing its work, loosening the tight muscles in her small face. "It's late," I said, my voice as soft as I could make it. "You can take my bed. It's warmer near the fire." She looked at the bed, then back at me. "Where will you sleep?" "I'll be right here in my chair," I said, settling into it. "This old thing is more comfortable than it looks, and I'm a light sleeper. Don't you worry about me." She hesitated for a moment, then gave me a small, solemn nod. She padded over to the bed, still wrapped in her blankets, and climbed in. I watched her, a tiny lump beneath the heavy quilts, her eyes just visible over the edge. She was staring at me. "Good night, Kai," I said, my voice feeling thick in my throat. "You're safe now." She didn't answer, but I saw her eyes close. I sat in my chair, the fire crackling in the silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the world was still, a profound, disorienting stillness. My life, my carefully ordered, solitary world, had been irrevocably shattered in a single moment. I'd offered her shelter, yes. That was the simple part. But as I watched her sleep, I realized with a jolt of panic that I might have done more than that. I might have opened a door I couldn't close. I had given a frightened little girl a place to stay, but I had also, in that same gesture, given her something far more terrifying, a claim on a solitary old man's heart. I stared at the fire until it burned down to glowing embers, the questions swirling in my mind. Who was she? Why was she here? And what was I supposed to do with this unexpected, terrifying, and strangely wonderful gift I'd been given? The first few weeks were a delicate and silent dance, a careful, wordless negotiation of territory between an old man set in his ways and a feral little creature who had been forced to build walls so high I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to see over them. We were like two animals, circling each other, neither one wanting to make the first move that would break the fragile, unspoken truce. My cabin, once a sanctuary of quiet predictability, now felt like a stage for a play I didn't know the lines for. The silence that had been my companion for years was now heavy with unspoken questions. I was a man who knew the mountains, the weather, the habits of the deer and the foxes. I knew nothing about the habits of a grieving, silent little girl. Kai was a ghost in my home. I'd find her in the mornings, sitting on the floor by the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the flames dance. She'd stay there for hours, her face utterly blank, her dark eyes giving nothing away. She didn't explore, didn't touch anything, didn't ask questions. She just existed. It was as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible, as if she was terrified of being a bother, of being a burden that would eventually be cast out. My attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic answers or just silence. "Are you hungry?" A nod. "Do you like the stew?" A shrug. "Did you sleep well?" A blink. It was like trying to talk to a stone, a sad, terrified stone. My instinct, honed by a lifetime of dealing with the wild, was to give her space, to not crowd her. Patience, I told myself. You've outwaited a dying fire before. You can outwait this. But I was also watching her. A constant, silent surveillance that I tried to pretend was just a matter of concern. I saw the small tremble in her hands when she ate, the way she flinched at any sudden noise, the way her eyes would widen with a flash of pure terror if I so much as stood up too quickly. She was a raw nerve, and I was fumbling around in the dark, terrified of touching the wrong thing and shattering her completely. My routine was the only constant I had to offer. I got up at dawn, split wood, checked the lines. I'd set a place for her at the table, a small stool I'd hastily fashioned from a stump across from my own. I'd serve our meals in silence, occasionally making comments about the weather, which she would acknowledge with only the slightest glance. "You know," I said one morning as we ate our oatmeal, "I've always thought snow had a smell. People say it doesn't, that it has no scent, but they're wrong. It smells like the world holding its breath, like a fresh start." She paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. I thought I saw a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She returned to her oatmeal, and we fell back into silence. I found myself talking more and more, just to fill the space she seemed to take with her quiet sadness. I told her about my life, about my journey to the mountains, about the old mule, Maud, who had died the winter before. I told her about the family of foxes that lived under the boulder by the creek, the way the mother would play with her kits in the spring, tumbling and chasing each other through the ferns. I told her about my grandmother's sage. She never responded, not with words, but I noticed her listening. Her head would tilt a fraction when I talked. Her eyes would follow me as I moved around the cabin. The oppressive silence was slowly being replaced by a different kind of silence, one that was more watchful, more present. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was as unexpected as the girl herself. She was sitting in the corner, drawing with a stub of charcoal on a piece of scrap paper I'd given her. I was repairing a leak in the roof, a job I'd been putting off for months. It was a fiddly, frustrating task that required a lot of cursing and patience. I was wrestling with a stubborn piece of tar paper when I heard a sound. A small, high-pitched sound that I'd never heard before in my cabin. It was a giggle. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. Had I imagined it? I risked a glance down from my precarious perch on the roof. Kai was looking up at me, her dark eyes shining. A small smile was playing on her lips, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. I had been so focused on my work, muttering and grumbling under my breath, that I hadn't realized I was making a spectacle of myself. "Sorry," I muttered, feeling a flush of heat creep up my neck. "This blasted thing is not cooperating. I think it's laughing at me." Her smile widened. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. The small, shared moment was a gift, a bridge built from a tiny, unexpected sound. It was the first sign that the frozen little creature I'd found in the snow was still in there, and she was slowly, cautiously beginning to thaw. From that day on, things began to shift. She became my shadow, following me around the cabin and the yard with an unspoken curiosity. She never got in the way, just observed, a quiet, watchful presence. I taught her how to split kindling, how to tell the difference between the tracks of a rabbit and a squirrel. She learned to recognize the different calls of the birds, and one day she pointed to a flash of blue in the trees and whispered, "Blue jay." It was the first time she'd initiated anything. "Yes," I said, a lump forming in my throat. "That's a blue jay, a noisy one too. He's probably complaining about the lack of peanuts." She turned and looked at me, and I saw a spark of something new in her eyes, a spark of trust. It was fragile, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew, but it was there. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would do everything in my power to protect that spark. Weeks turned into months. Spring came, then summer, a gentle and verdant season that painted the mountains in shades of green and gold. The solitude of my cabin was no longer a quiet retreat. It was a home. My world, once defined by a simple routine, now revolved around a small, silent girl with dark, fathomless eyes and a tentative smile that could light up the darkest corner of my soul. But the questions were still there, a quiet, persistent hum in the back of my mind. She'd given me a name, but nothing else. No story, no explanation for how she came to be alone in a blizzard. I was afraid to push, afraid that any direct question would send her back into her shell. The fragile trust we'd built was too precious to risk. I let it be, pushing the questions aside. We had the present, and that was enough. For now. The night the question finally burst out, the air was heavy with the scent of rain. A summer storm was rolling in, and we were inside, the cabin's single window rattling with the gusts of wind. I was reading a book of old mountain tales, trying to explain to her why a man would choose to live so far from everything. "Out here," I said, "you know what you are. You're not a name on a ledger or a number in a book. You're the man who can start a fire in the rain, the one who can track a deer for miles. You're part of the mountain. It's a kind of freedom you can't find in a town." She was playing with a piece of string, her fingers moving in a complex pattern I couldn't follow. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Is that why you don't have a family?" she asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the growing wind. The question caught me off guard. It was the first time she had asked me anything personal. I looked into her eyes, seeing the same deep, ancient sadness reflected there. "I had a family once," I said, my voice quiet. "A long time ago, I had a wife and a daughter." The admission hung in the air, heavy and painful. I'd never told anyone that. I barely acknowledged it to myself. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. My eyes were drawn to the fire, its flames dancing and crackling in the darkening room. I remembered the way Ellen's hair used to catch the light, the same color as the embers. I remembered the sound of Lily's laughter. I remembered the sickness that had come for them, swift and cruel, taking them from me one after the other, leaving me hollow and lost in a world that no longer made sense. "They died," I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "A long time ago. When I lost them, I couldn't stay in the world we'd built together. I had to go find a new place, a place with no memories." I looked back at her and I saw that her eyes were filled with tears. She understood. She understood loss on a level that no child should ever have to. And in that moment, I knew the truth of her own story. "Why were you out in the storm, Kai?" I asked, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "All alone." She was silent for a long moment, her fingers stilling on the string. The wind howled, and a flash of lightning lit up the room, casting stark, dancing shadows. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "They're gone," she whispered, her tears finally spilling over. "My parents. There was a sickness at the camp, a fever. We tried to get to the next town, but the snow was too deep. My father made me a shelter, told me to stay. He said they would come back, but they never did." She didn't need to say anything more. I knew what happened. I had seen the look on her face that first day. The kind of survival that comes from a desperate act of love. Her parents had given her their warmth, their shelter, their very lives to give her a chance. She was staring at me, her small chest heaving with silent sobs, the weight of her grief finally breaking free. I didn't know what to say. Words felt cheap, useless, so I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms. And she came. The dam she'd built so carefully finally broke. She ran to me, burrowing into my chest, her small body racked with sobs. I held her, my own eyes burning with unshed tears, my old heart feeling as if it was breaking and mending at the same time. I held her until her tears ran dry and her breathing evened out into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. I held her as the storm raged on outside, a tiny, fierce life in my arms, a life that I had promised in my own heart to protect with every breath I had left. The rain came down in sheets, a cleansing, mournful sound against the roof. I sat in the darkness, the weight of her small body against my chest, the scent of rain and wood smoke filling the air. I was no longer just a lonely old man. I was something else. I was her shelter. I was her anchor in a world that had been so cruel to her. I had been looking for a place without memories, but I had found a place to make new ones. And in that moment, I understood that the little girl I had pulled from the snow had done more than just survive. She had given me back a part of my own heart I thought I had buried years ago. The winter after that first summer was a brutal one, the kind of winter that tests the mettle of any man or creature. It arrived with a vengeance in late October, a savage, early blizzard that howled down from the peaks and buried us in 6 feet of snow before we could even blink. The isolation that had once been my solace became a formidable adversary. It was now me and Kai, trapped in the cabin, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of white and cold. Kai was my anchor. She had stopped being a burden or a responsibility. She was my family. The change was so gradual, so natural that I barely noticed it had happened. She talked more now, her voice a soft, melodic counterpoint to the howling wind. She still had her silences, moments when the old sadness would creep back into her eyes, but they were less frequent. We had our routines, our small traditions. We'd make popcorn over the fire. She'd tell me stories, fanciful tales about the animals she imagined living in the forest. I'd teach her the old songs my mother used to sing. I was no longer a man speaking to a ghost. I was a father talking to his daughter. "Silas," she said one evening, her brow furrowed in concentration as she helped me mend a torn piece of canvas. "Why don't you ever talk about the old days, before you came to the mountains?" I looked at her, her face lit by the warm glow of the fire. It was a question I'd been dreading. The past was a locked room in my mind, filled with ghosts I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But Kai had earned my trust. She had given me her story, her grief. It was only fair that I gave her mine. "I told you about my wife and daughter," I said, my voice low. "I didn't tell you how it all happened, how I let it happen." Her eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She just waited, her needle pausing in midair. I took a deep breath, the words feeling like they were being torn from my throat. "Ellen, my wife, she got sick. It was a fever that swept through our town. We were poor and the doctor was miles away. I was working in the fields trying to bring in the harvest before it was too late. I told myself it was just a cold. I told myself she'd be fine. I was so busy, so focused on my work that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me." I paused, the familiar wave of guilt and grief washing over me. It was a sensation I knew intimately, a cold, dark tide that threatened to drown me. "Lily, our daughter, she was just a little thing barely older than you are now," she tried to tell me. She came to me one day, tugging at my sleeve, her little face pale. "Papa," she said, "Mama won't wake up. Mama is so tired." But I was a fool. I patted her head and told her I'd be in soon. I could see the memory as clearly as if it were happening now. My beautiful Ellen, her skin pale as death, her breath a shallow, rasping thing. My little Lily, curled up beside her, her own cheeks flushed with the same fever. When I got back to the house, it was too late. They were both gone. Ellen had died that morning, and Lily had followed her. She just gave up. She was too young, too small to fight it alone, and I wasn't there. Kai's eyes were filled with tears. She set down her needle and came to me, putting her small hand on my arm. "It wasn't your fault, Silas," she whispered. "Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't," I said, my voice thick. "But the shame of it, the guilt of letting them die alone. It was a poison. I couldn't stay there. Every corner of that house held a memory. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like Lily's laugh. Every whisper of the wind sounded like Ellen's voice. So I ran." She was silent for a long time. Then in her soft, quiet voice she said, "I used to think my father was a bad man. He was a stubborn, proud man, and he did things that made my mother cry. But when the sickness came, he didn't run. He took care of us. He built me that shelter. He held my mother's hand until the very end. He made sure I was safe. He gave me everything he had, even his own life." She looked up at me, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering love. "You did the same thing, Silas. You gave me shelter, you gave me your food, you gave me your kindness. You didn't run from the blizzard, you ran into it. You didn't let me die." I stared at her, this small, wise creature who had somehow seen through my shame and found the broken, good man I used to be. She was right. I had spent a decade running from a past I couldn't change, drowning in a guilt that had become a part of who I was. But Kai, with her simple, profound understanding, had given me a key to a lock I had long thought rusted shut. She leaned into me and I put my arm around her, pulling her close. The fire crackled and popped, and the wind howled outside, but in that small cabin there was peace. A profound, hard-won peace. The worst of the winter came in January. A single, relentless blizzard that seemed to have no end. The snow piled up against the cabin, burying the door. We were trapped inside for days, our supplies running low. I was beginning to worry. The flour was nearly gone, and I was down to my last 2 cans of beans. The woodpile was outside, buried under 6 feet of snow. I'd have to dig a tunnel just to get to it. Kai sensed my worry. She didn't say anything, just became more helpful, more diligent in her chores. She made sure the dishes were spotless, that the fire was never left to burn too low. One morning, I woke up to find her sitting on the bed, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She was holding her beloved little drawing book. Silas, she said, her voice quiet but firm, I'm going to go with you. Go where? I asked, confused. To dig out the firewood. I shook my head. No, Kai, it's too dangerous out there. The snow is too deep and the cold is brutal. You can't come. I can, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm strong and I can help. You can't do it alone. You'll get tired and you might get hurt. If you get hurt, we'll both be in trouble. I'm not going to let you be alone. Her words hit me like a physical blow. It was exactly what I had said to her months ago in the middle of a different blizzard. The student had surpassed the teacher. I looked into her determined face and saw the same fierce spirit that had kept her alive in the mountains. She was no longer a frightened child. She was a survivor, and she was my partner. I didn't argue, I just nodded and handed her a warm wool hat. All right then, I said, but you stay right behind me, and you do exactly as I say. No heroics. She nodded, her expression serious. We spent the next few hours digging a tunnel through the snow to the woodpile. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. The snow was heavy and wet, and it felt like we were digging through concrete. But we worked side by side, taking breaks when we got tired. I would break a path and she would follow, clearing away the loose snow with her small shovel. We didn't talk much, just the grunt of effort and the rhythmic sound of the shovels biting into the snow. When we finally reached the woodpile, the relief was immense. We dragged back as much wood as we could carry, our arms aching, our faces raw with the cold. Back inside the cabin, we collapsed by the fire, exhausted but triumphant. Kai looked at me, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, and she smiled. It was a smile of pure pride. We did it, she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I smiled back, my heart swelling with a feeling I had long forgotten. It was more than just pride. It was a sense of partnership, of belonging, of being connected to another person in a way that transcended words. We did, I agreed. We make a pretty good team, don't we, Kai? She nodded, her smile deepening. The best team, she whispered. That night we ate a simple meal of beans and rice, and it tasted like the most delicious food I had ever eaten. As I watched her sleep, her face peaceful in the firelight, a thought settled in my mind, a thought so profound it felt like a revelation. I had been running from the past for so long, trying to find a place without memories, but I had been looking in the wrong direction. The place wasn't about forgetting, it was about creating. It was about forging new memories with someone who had given me a second chance at life, at love, at being a father. I had offered her a place to stay, a simple act of charity, but what I had received in return was something I had thought was lost forever, a reason to hope, a reason to live, a reason to stop running. The years that followed were the richest of my life. The blizzard that had forced us to dig our way to the woodpile became a story we told each other, a shared victory that bound us even closer. The seasons turned, each one bringing its own rhythm, its own beauty. We worked the land together, planting a small garden in the spring, preserving the bounty of the summer. I taught her to track animals, to read the sky, to find her way by the stars. She taught me to laugh, to see the wonder in the world, to let go of a past I had been clinging to like a shipwrecked sailor to a piece of wreckage. There were still difficult days. There were moments when the ghosts of my past would whisper in my ear, reminding me of the family I had lost. Kai would see the shadows in my eyes and know what I was thinking. She'd come and sit beside me, her presence a silent, comforting balm. Sometimes she'd ask me to tell her stories about Lily, about my Ellen. It was painful, but it was a healing pain, like a wound that had finally been allowed to close. Talking about them with her took away their power to hurt. It turned them from a source of guilt into a source of remembrance. You have to let them go, Silas, she told me one evening. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. They're gone, but you're not. You're here, with me. We're alive. That's a gift. Don't waste it by living in the past. She had grown into a young woman, wise beyond her years, her dark eyes holding a depth of understanding that still surprised me. She was no longer the frightened little girl I'd found in the snow. She was strong, resilient, and full of a quiet, fierce joy that was infectious. "When did you get to be so smart?" I teased her. "I always was," she said, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "You just weren't listening." I laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that came from my belly. It was a sound that had become more and more common in our home, a testament to the light she had brought into my life. But the outside world, the world we had left behind, wasn't quite ready to let us go. The specter of the past, a past I had tried so hard to escape, reappeared one crisp autumn morning. I was out chopping wood, the sound of my axe a steady, rhythmic beat when I heard a noise. The distant sound of a horse's whinny. My blood ran cold. We rarely had visitors. The isolated cabin was our sanctuary, and the arrival of a stranger felt like an invasion. I gripped my axe tighter and walked around the side of the cabin. A man was dismounting from his horse, a tall, well-dressed figure with a stern face and a dark, pressed suit. He looked utterly out of place in the wilderness. He carried a leather satchel and wore a look of grim determination. He spotted me and gave a curt nod. "Silas." "I am," I said, my voice guarded. "And you are?" "My name is Arthur. I'm a lawyer from the town of Miller's Hollow. I've been looking for you for a long time." My heart began to pound. "What do you want?" He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the cabin. "I'm here about a girl. Kai, it's been almost a decade, and I understand she might be living with you." I felt the blood drain from my face. My grip on the axe tightened until my knuckles were white. The past I had tried to forget was standing right in front of me in the form of a lawyer sent to collect a debt I didn't owe. My mind raced. How did he know? How had they found us? And what did he want with Kai? "Kai is my daughter," I said, the words coming out in a low growl. "She's been my daughter for years. You have no claim on her." "I think you'll find that I do," Arthur said, his voice unwavering. "Her parents died without a will. As a minor, her care fell to the state. When she disappeared, I was assigned to find her. There are relatives, a distant aunt in a neighboring county, who have been looking for her. She belongs with them. She's not yours, Silas. She never was." A cold fury washed over me. It was a primal, protective rage, an instinct that was older than words. This man, this bureaucrat in a suit, thought he could walk into my life and take the most precious thing in it away from me. He thought he could separate us just like that. "Get off my land," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Now." "She's a minor," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "Legally, she has no say in the matter. Her aunt is her nearest living relative. She's willing to take her in to give her a proper home." "A proper home," I exploded, my voice cracking. "She has a proper home, right here, with me. She has a home, a family, a life. Who are you to come here and take that away from her?" Kai appeared in the doorway, her face pale. She had heard the commotion. She looked from me to Arthur, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Silas," she whispered, "what's going on?" The sight of her, the fear in her eyes, broke something inside me. My anger deflated, replaced by a wave of despair. I couldn't let them take her. I couldn't. But I was just an old man, far from the law, with nothing but a cabin and a lifetime of regret. What could I possibly do? Arthur explained the situation to her, his voice professional and detached. He told her about the aunt she had never met, the distant relative who was willing to give her a home. I watched Kai's face, the color draining from her cheeks, her eyes filling with a familiar, desperate fear. "No," she said, her voice a tiny, broken whisper. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here. I'm not leaving Silas." "I'm afraid that's not how it works," Arthur said, his tone firm. "You're a child. You don't get to make that choice." "Then I'll run away again," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. "I'll run away into the mountains. I won't come back. I'll starve before I let you take me away from here." Her words hung in the air, a promise of a future that was unthinkable. I saw the resolve in her eyes, the same fierce spirit that had led her to survive all those years ago. She meant every word. She would rather die than be torn from the only real family she had ever known. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let it come to that. I couldn't let them tear her away. I looked at Arthur, his face impassive, and a crazy, desperate idea began to form in my mind. "You said she needs a family," I said, my voice low and steady. "The court needs to see she has a family, a legal one. Well, she has one. She has me." Arthur looked at me, his expression skeptical. "You're not a relative, Silas. It's not that simple." "It can be," I said, my voice rising. "She has no one else. She has no living relatives who care for her. I am the only father she's ever known. I am the only family she's ever had. And I will go before a judge and fight for her if I have to. I will do whatever it takes. So you can go back to your office and tell them that if they want her, they'll have to come and take her from a dead man, because that's the only way she's leaving here." He stared at me and I stared back. The wind howled through the trees and the leaves swirled around us. A long, tense silence stretched between us. Then, to my utter shock, Arthur sighed. It was a deep, weary sigh that seemed to drain the fight out of him. "Look," he said, his voice softening. "I don't want to take a child away from a home where she's clearly loved. My job is to find her and to see that she's safe. If I can see with my own eyes that she is safe, that she's being cared for, then perhaps I can make a case to the court. Perhaps I can have the guardianship transferred to you." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak. "You can do that." "I can try," he said. "But it's not a guarantee. I'd have to go before a judge. There would be hearings. It wouldn't be easy." "It doesn't have to be easy," I said. "It just has to be possible." Kai came and stood beside me, her small hand slipping into mine. Her grip was cold, but it was firm. We looked at Arthur together, a united front. I saw something shift in his face. A flicker of respect, perhaps. Or maybe just the resignation of a man who had lost a battle he didn't even really want to fight. The months that followed were a blur of legal paperwork and court appearances. It was a world I knew nothing about, a labyrinth of rules and regulations. But I was determined. I would move mountains for her. I fought tooth and nail, and Kai, with her quiet dignity and her heartbreaking story, was my most powerful weapon. She spoke to the judge in her soft, steady voice, telling him about the blizzard, about her parents, about finding a new family in a cabin in the mountains. She told him she had never felt safer or more loved in her entire life. In the end, it was enough. The judge, a man with kind eyes and a weary expression, ruled in our favor. The guardianship was transferred to me. Kai was legally mine. I never felt anything like the joy I felt that day. We walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand, the world feeling brighter, more alive than it ever had before. Kai looked up at me, her eyes shining with tears of happiness, and she smiled. It was the first time I'd seen a smile that was completely free of the old sadness. "We did it," she said. "We're a family." I squeezed her hand. "We always were, Kai, we always were." The drive back to the cabin was long and winding, through the familiar mountains that had been my sanctuary for so long. As we approached the final ridge, I saw it. A small, unfamiliar shape by the front door. A faint glint of metal in the afternoon sun. It was a weather vane cast in the shape of a hawk. He had brought a gift. A symbol of hope, of freedom. Kai rushed ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees. She examined the gift, her face lit with pure joy. I watched her, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. I thought of the little girl I had found in the snow, a frightened, silent specter of grief. I thought of the long, hard years of learning to trust, of building a home from the ashes of two broken pasts. I thought of the lawyer, the court case, the fight to keep her. And I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that I would do it all again, 1,000 times over. I had been a man running from his past, seeking a place without memories. But what I had found was something far greater. I had found a home, not in a cabin but in the heart of a child. I had found a reason to live, a reason to love, a reason to belong to the world again. The ghosts of my past were no longer chains that bound me. They were just memories, softened by time and by the love of a daughter who had given me back my life. Kai's laughter drifted up the path and I started walking towards her, a smile on my face. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities and uncertainties. But for the first time in my life, I was ready to embrace it. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a father, and I was home.